Thank you. I'd like to tell you about an explosion, a bombing that took place about a month ago. The explosion was heard throughout the entire city. It ripped through 2 apartment buildings. 250 apartments were damaged. And photos from the scene showed rows of shattered windows and demolished balconies. Children in a nearby kindergarten had to be evacuated. Hospitals went into disaster mode. In the end, 25 people were only lightly injured. And according to local police, it was absolutely incredible that there were no more severe injuries. This is the kind of news that we associate with war zones. Does anyone know where this bombing took place 1 month ago? Sweden, that's right. And remarkably, it wasn't the only explosion in Sweden that day or that week. In the end, a total of 6 blasts were reported in Sweden in 7 days. We still don't know who was behind this particular bombing. But explosions are nothing out of the ordinary for Sweden these days. And they're usually tied to conflicts between criminal gangs, mainly in the country's immigrant neighborhoods. So far in 2019, we've had over 100 explosions. And in fact, I checked the news last night, and there was another explosion in another small Swedish city, and it was also heard across town. No injuries this time. The use of hand grenades particularly stands out. In fact, according to Swedish police, the use of hand grenades among criminals in Sweden is without parallel in the world for countries which are not at war. My topic today is nationalism as an antidote to tribalism, and I'm going to talk to you about Sweden, because I believe that Sweden's experience of immigration, segregation, and crime is a valuable case study for the topic of nations, nation-states, and nationalism. Sweden is very much part of the current European anti-nationalist paradigm. The idea of the nation-state is challenged by radical ideas of the elite, and also by the phenomenon of large-scale immigration without sufficient integration. Sweden is not unique in this sense, but it is unique in how far it has gone with the anti-nationalist ideology. And it is unique in the way that it is, as a result, plagued by a new kind of tribalism. Of course, if we go back in history to the Viking Age, Sweden, like other Scandinavian countries, was a tribal society consisting of Norse and Germanic tribes. Then, across the centuries, through a process of civilization, Christianization, and state building, the tribes dissolved and Sweden adopted a universalist culture. We had one tribe, and that was the nation. In a short time, maybe less than a generation, Sweden has gone from a nation rightly considered a model of social cohesion, equality, low crime, high trust, political stability, to an increasingly incoherent society with growing pockets of social unrest. So think of this as a case study of what happens when the very idea of the nation-state is abandoned in favor of radical, multicultural, elite ideology. Because of this ideology, Sweden now is a deeply divided society. Take school results, for instance. 17.5% of all school children fail to complete mandatory education. That's years 1 to 9, 17.5%. In an immigrant area in Gothenburg, the corresponding figure is 70%, 70. And needless to say, kids in such neighborhoods are especially vulnerable to gangs who are looking to recruit children. Immigration to Sweden has been exceptionally high for the entire past generation, not just during the asylum wave when Sweden took in more immigrants per capita than any other country in Europe. Immigrants and the children of immigrants make up about a quarter of the Swedish population today. And I am myself part of that statistic as the daughter of refugees from Poland. So I want to stress that I'm in no way against immigration in itself. But Sweden has clearly taken in more immigrants than it's been able to integrate. And throughout this entire project, nationalism was a dirty word. Patriotism was a dirty word. And of course, there are good reasons to criticize negative nationalism. Nationalism in the form of aggressive chauvinism. But the Swedish experiment had no room for positive nationalism that would include newcomers. Instead, leading politicians approached the issue of immigration by denying and even ridiculing their own culture. So Fredrik Reinfeldt, Sweden's center-right prime minister 2006 to 2014, infamously said, "Only barbarism is genuinely Swedish. All other development came from abroad." Barbarism. Meanwhile, his main political opponent, the now former leader of the Social Democratic Party, Mona Sahlin, suggested, "Swedes are jealous of immigrants because you have a culture, an identity, a history, something that brings you together. And what do we have? Midsummer's Eve and such silly things." So this is the ideology. But in reality, of course, Sweden does have more to offer immigrants than barbarism. There is a Swedish culture, there is a Swedish language that you need to learn if you want to become part of the Swedish society. And by pretending that these things are of no value, Swedish elites have effectively kept newcomers from becoming part of their new society. With this comes physical separation as well. We now have growing immigrant areas where unemployment, social welfare dependency, and crime are rampant. We had 3 such areas in 1990. Within 2 decades, the number had grown to almost 200. Some of these areas are at times dangerous for outsiders to enter, which is why you may have heard of Swedish no-go zones. And still, in spite of such obvious problems, during the immigration wave, it was considered outrageous to even ask the simple question, how much immigration can we handle? That was a racist question, as you can imagine. The idea was that the nation state could not have a national interest that is separate from the good of humanity. Which is why, in spite of growing problems of segregation, crime, inequality, radicalization, Sweden now has among the highest number of ISIS fighters per capita in Europe. In spite of all of this, Sweden has continued to allow an exceptionally high level of immigration. And this is also why we are filling up already dysfunctional neighborhoods with new immigrants. So let's take a look at these dysfunctional neighborhoods. I've already mentioned explosives, but Sweden is also extreme with respect to gun violence compared to its Scandinavian neighbors. And we know that 9 out of 10 suspects who are tied to shootings in public are either first or second generation immigrants. And what we see in these areas, these immigrant neighborhoods, where the nation state is weak, is that universalism does not arise. Instead, we see a new tribalism emerging. We see this tribalism most clearly in crime that is gang-related. Gangs are tribes or clans. And as in all tribes, for these gangs, honor is a hard currency. These gangs can attack each other with automatic guns and even hand grenades as a response to perceived insults. There's also a new kind of tribalism in attacks on people who are perceived as outsiders, who enter these neighborhoods. In Malmö, 2 TV reporters entered the area of Rosengård wearing a kippah and a Star of David in 2015. And they were forced out of the area in a collective effort by residents. People threw eggs from the windows. And it later turned out that text messages had circulated in the neighborhood saying that Jews had been spotted entering the area. 2 years later, when President Trump announced the move of the American embassy in Israel, about 200 people gathered in central Malmö, chanted that they declared an intifada for Malmö, and there were calls to shoot the Jews. The Gothenburg synagogue was attacked with firebombs. But this doesn't just affect Jews. When Swedish public television accompanied a woman named Mona Walter to an immigrant neighborhood in Stockholm, Rinkeby, she was immediately recognized, threatened, and forced to leave. Why do you think? She's a Somali who has converted to Christianity. Mona Walter tried to argue with her attackers. She said, "But we are in Sweden." And the response came, "This is not Sweden." Journalists are also seen as intruders, and since there have been repeated attacks on reporters in these areas. When a crew from Australian 60 Minutes was in the same area as Mona Walter, they were attacked with rocks, and the photographer was deliberately hit by a car. His foot was run over by a car. The same thing when Norwegian television tried to film in another such area in Stockholm. During an interview with a Swedish-Kurdish economist, Tino Sanandaji, like the 60 Minutes crew, they were threatened and forced to leave. And then we have the exclusion of women from public spaces. If we return to Rinkeby, the neighborhood where Mona Walter and 60 Minutes were attacked, for years, women have been excluded from public spaces in this neighborhood. Girls who have tried merely to sit down and have a coffee have been verbally abused. Again, in tribal settings, honor is a hard currency. And it never stops with your honor. It's your sister's honor, and your neighbor's honor, and the honor of the relatives of the girl who's trying to sit down and have coffee next to you. And this, by the way, in the country which boasts the first feminist government in the world. So unrest and crime in these areas is new not just in scope, but also in kind. Perhaps the most shocking expression of this new tribalism can be seen in attacks on paramedics and firefighters. Systematic attacks on first responders were, of course, unknown in Sweden only a generation ago. When I interviewed the chairman of the Swedish Paramedics Union, he explained to me that no-go zones are a reality to Swedish paramedics. There are areas where first responders have to wait for police protection before they can enter. And his estimate is that ambulances are forced to retreat from such areas every single week. A couple of years ago, I spoke to an experienced firefighter in Stockholm. And he told me that not long ago, people would rush to help if there was a fire. And these days, he said, we have to have extra staff to guard the fire engine so that it doesn't get vandalized while we are working on the scene. The Swedish state has responded with a project called The Human Being Behind the Uniform, in which youths from, this is very Swedish, we have something called dialogue police as well, so you can imagine. So youths from crime-ridden areas get to meet first responders, learn about their jobs and what they do, and this way the kids learn that first responders are human beings. And this is described by Swedish media as something very successful and very positive. Imagine that. Paramedics and firefighters come to these areas to save lives. And some residents need to be taught through special government programs that they are actually flesh and blood human beings. This is tribal logic. Then, of course, there's violence against police. We've had numerous attacks, including a number of hand grenade attacks against police in the past few years. On April 7th, 2 years ago, Sweden saw its first deadly Islamist terror attack. 5 people were killed as a truck rammed pedestrians in a busy Stockholm street. All Sweden, as I'm sure you can imagine, was in shock and in pain. And the capital was in lockdown for hours. There was a spontaneous outpouring of support for police. And the headlines in the country's 2 biggest newspapers the next morning read, "Sweden stands united against terror. Sweden stands united in sorrow." But that's not really true. Because on the very same night as the terror attack, when Stockholm was still in lockdown, police were attacked with rocks in an immigrant neighborhood in Stockholm. The same thing happened the next night in Gothenburg. And the night after that, only then, attackers used Molotov cocktails against police. So not even when Sweden was at its most vulnerable did these attackers feel part of the Swedish nation. All nations adopt foreigners, and these foreigners become part of the social fabric, and viewing their adopted country as part of themselves. But that's not what's happening here to a large extent. So let's go back to where we started, with Sweden as a case study of the issues we're discussing here. What we see here is the retreat of the state. And the alternative to the nation state is not universalism. It's also not a state of nature, the way many of us in here are trained to think about a state of nature as everyone's war against all. In fact, that idea of the state of nature is inconsistent with what we know about human psychology. We're not just selfish individuals. We belong to larger groups. We have a deeply rooted need to belong to larger groups. The nation state has channeled this need in a constructive and positive way, which is why nationalism has worked as an antidote to tribalism, whereas multiculturalism, as a matter of experience, risks degenerating into tribalism. Just look at Sweden. Thank you.